Hi, I'm Howard Shalowitz, and welcome to the program. Today we are privileged to have George Leopold, who is an author of a new book called Calculated Risk, The Supersonic Life and Times of Gus Grissom. And he will be joining us from his home, actually, and we are going to welcome him right now.
Good to be with you, Howard.
Thank you. Great to have you here. So let me ask you this first. You're a tremendous author. What got you interested in becoming an author?
Well, writing is about trying to get at the truth, and you can do that by communicating in various ways. You can talk or you can write, and I chose to write. I was interested in science, wasn't very good at math, but I liked to write, so I kept at it. I was always interested in human space travel, exploration of the solar system. So I sort of channeled my science writing skills into that area of expertise. Having the passion for it, and eventually getting this book out about the life of one of the great astronauts, Gus Grissom.
And your works have actually appeared in the New Scientist and the New York Times and other publications over a course of really decades. Is that right?
Yeah, I got a science writing graduate degree from Columbia University. They had a great science writing program. I've been covering technology for 30, 35 years, but always sort of maintained this interest in space, aerospace, and I finally found a subject I could commit 7 years of my life to, and that was Virgil by Gus Grissom.
And you're joining us from your home in Virginia right now, although many of the things that happened in this took place in Florida with the life of Gus Grissom. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. Was from a small town in southern Indiana, not far from you folks, just down the road from St. Louis. And one of the things that sort of grabbed me about Gus was he came from this small town. He had to work hard, joined the Air Force, got into World War II, but ended up flying a typewriter or a desk, not an airplane. But he went to school, got a degree in engineering from Purdue University, my publisher, and ended up in Korea, flew 100 combat missions, tried to go back, and ended up becoming a flight instructor, and just kept moving his way up what pilots call the right stuff pyramid.
And I read the book cover to cover, and including the inside covers, just a fascinating background about Gus Grissom. And when you said he grew up in southern Indiana, he actually worked very hard, and it wasn't just at school. He worked delivering papers in the morning and in the evening so that he could actually subsidize himself and his family as a young boy. So he had this strong work ethic that I think was in your first chapter or second chapter of the book. Can you tell us a little bit about his background in Indiana, things that he did that we really don't see that much today of young men?
Yeah, he grew up during the Depression, but his father worked for the B&O Railroad, so they had a fairly stable family life. But Gus was the eldest of four children, and his future wife Betty Moore Grissom, always said that Gus always seemed to have a job delivering newspapers, picking crops in the summer, all kinds of jobs. He always sort of wanted to have money in his pocket, and he would use that to go watch the newsreels at the local theater and watch the reports. That's how people got their information about World War II before the internet, and that fueled his interest in flying and aviation. And he tried to get into the Air Force, but graduated too late to get into World War II. But once he got his engineering degree, then the sort of the course of his life was set. He wanted to fly airplanes, to join the Air Force, and moved up the ranks until one day this organization called NASA called and said, "Would you like to become an astronaut?" And he made it
And
through hard work.
right, and he was always a hard worker. He went to Purdue University, as you mentioned, and he was born in 1926, so his childhood really was just laden with not being in a privileged environment, especially in southern Indiana, living in poverty, basically. and not a very wealthy family. Is that right?
Yeah, stable, wealthy. His father had a steady job, but he and his mother canned, and they had to pick the crops in the garden and so forth. So everybody pitched in, everybody took care of themselves, and Gus was the big brother. He set the example for his younger brothers. They looked up to him, and his brother Lowell, who lives in the St. Louis area, always said that Gus said, when an opportunity comes along, be ready to grab it. And he certainly did that with his own life and his own career.
And what I found interesting also that maybe people have never even thought of was that one of the first criteria of becoming an astronaut or fitting in one of these small spaces that you actually have to go in. If you're over 5'11", and you put this in your book, if you're over 5'11", you can't make it into the space program into doing this because of just
Right.
the constraints of the space inside of that capsule.
Yeah, if you're claustrophobic, being an astronaut is not a good profession. The early spacecraft where they had to, it was described as they had to shoehorn them in and they had to get them out with a can opener because weight was everything. So it was very small, very compact. They actually sat on couches that conformed to their bodies. So when you close that hatch, you're in a pretty confined space, and plus you're in a pressure suit. So Gus really fit the bill. He was only 5'7", and you're seeing a picture now of the Gemini spacecraft, which refers to two astronauts, which was also referred to as the Gusmobile, because Gus had a central hand in designing some of the systems, and it was really the first spacecraft that you could fly in space, and rather than just orbiting, going around the Earth, you could change your direction in space, and Gus played a central role at McDonald in St. Louis in designing the Gemini spacecraft.
And aside from the height requirement, they also had a very, very stringent psychological and physical tests among all of those who applied for the position as astronaut. And then they had other weaning processes all the way down to who they were going to select for the 3 or so individuals to actually go up in the rocket. Can you tell us a little bit about that selection process and how we get to maybe 3 or 6 or 7 astronauts who were selected out of dozens or hundreds of astronauts?
Right. So in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and which shocked the world. And our response was to create an agency called NASA. And at the time, President Dwight Eisenhower, decided we're going to have test pilots as candidates. And this new agency called NASA contacted about 165 test pilots asking if they'd be interested in coming in and talking about this new program, which was called Project Mercury. It was designed to get an American into orbit and do it before the Soviets, the Russians. And Gus got the call. He was an experienced test pilot at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio and had a very successful career. So he sort of took a chance, a risk in stopping his career and trying out for the astronaut corps. And these men were pretty much tortured by the by the doctors who were checking them out. They really didn't know if a man could survive in a weightless environment, so they had to do every test they could think of to find out if these men could take it. You had to pull many G's gravitational force, and how would the human body react to weightlessness and prolonged weightlessness. So they went through a lot of tests, and Gus decided he'd give it his best try. There were some very famous pilots, John Glenn, Alan Shepard. These guys were landing aircraft on aircraft carriers at night. So Gus gave it his best shot, and he made it. And you see there the picture of the three first American astronauts, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and John Glenn. So he had risen to the top of his profession through hard work and luck, but you make your own luck, I guess, right?
Right, that's right. And was it Einstein who said that success is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration?
absolutely. And Gus Grissom was certainly an example of that. Yep.
So let's jump ahead a little bit because you talked about President Eisenhower with Sputnik, and it was a time of the Cold War with Russia, and things were advancing with the Cold War, and we were always in competition, really in every field, with what was the Soviet Union at that time. So Gus Grissom was actually involved when he landed after orbiting for, I think, about 15 minutes. He was in flight for about 15 minutes and
Yes.
went in the Atlantic Ocean, and the hatch blew open. And a lot of people blamed Gus Grissom that it was his fault. He opened the hatch, but it started filling up with water, and he had to jump out basically into the Atlantic. And they blamed him, but history shows it was not his fault. There was a flaw in that hatch, and then the capsule actually sank to the bottom of the Atlantic, which they brought up some 30 years later. Tell us a
Right.
little bit about what happened there.
Okay, so Gus flies the second American manned space flight in July of 1961. He didn't actually go into orbit. It was called a ballistic flight. So his rocket could only take him up about 60 miles. He was weightless for about 5 minutes and came down. And a book and a movie called The Right Stuff made it appear over the years that Gus, when he landed, that he, for some reason, panicked and hit that exploding hatch that the astronauts had asked for and had been included on his spacecraft, Liberty Bell 7. My argument is that a person who was launched from a rocket, was weightless for 5 minutes, pulled about 8 or 9 Gs on the way down, observed a triangular tear in his main parachute as he was coming back down into the ocean. Why would that person panic once they're in the water? If anything, I think Gus would have been relieved
Hmm.
that his mission had gone, it was a textbook mission. But what happened was that he armed the hatch a little early, and I argue that one of the potential causes was that maybe the static electricity, when you see that helicopter hovering over the spacecraft, when the guys in the recovery crew touch the spacecraft, that may have blown the arm hatch. But it's a fiction to say that Gus Grissom hit the chicken switch. That didn't happen. He would never have been named an astronaut among all these great qualified candidates if he was afraid. He wasn't. The only thing he was afraid of was he was of drowning because he was in the water for almost 5 minutes and his suit was filling up with water.
And those were heavy
So
suits at that time.
yeah, right. And normally you would close oxygen inlet so you'd have some flotation, and that's what the guys in the recovery crew thought. But Gus was actually sinking, and he almost drowned. But this was the defining moment of Gus Grissom's career. Everybody remembers that image of Gus hanging there almost like a dead fish getting hauled into a helicopter, and he loses his spacecraft. And no aviator ever wants to lose their spacecraft. But, he licked his wounds and he made a comeback.
Of course, Kennedy in January of 61 became the President of the United States, and during his presidency, he announced before the end of the decade that we will land a man on the moon. And sure enough, we know what came about in July 20th of 1969, that the first man walked on the moon, and that, of course, was Neil Armstrong. But it may have been Gus Grissom had not something else happened in January of 1967. So why don't we start, and we'll kind of move backwards, because that was the tragedy that you write about so eloquently in your book about what happened to Gus and two other astronauts in January of 1967 during a test run. Basically, it wasn't actually just the actual liftoff. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. So Gus is selected to command the first mission of Project Apollo. And as you see, there'll be three astronauts, and ultimately two of those astronauts will go down and walk on the surface of the moon. And this puts Gus Grissom in the position of possibly being the first human being to walk on the moon. And his spacecraft is very complex and it's got a lot of problems. One of the reasons Gus was selected was because he was such a good engineer, and they thought he could help to get this spacecraft off the ground. So on January 27th, uh, 1967, they're going to do this test, and it's basically a simulation of the countdown, 3, 2, 1, launch. And then they would pull the plugs, and the spacecraft batteries would kick in. And the test illustrated what a bad spacecraft the Apollo 1's Block 1 spacecraft was. There were all kinds of communications problems. And the key thing was that they closed the hatches, the crew was in their suits, and the spacecraft was filled with pure oxygen, not the air that we breathe, which is about 60% oxygen, or nitrogen, and 40% oxygen. And this creates a very dangerous situation if you have any materials in the spacecraft that are flammable, and in this case there were, plus a hatch that was very difficult to open. And if you get a spark in that environment, it's disastrous, and that's exactly what happened. The belief is that a spark underneath Gus's couch ignited a fire within the spacecraft. Gus and his senior pilot, Ed White, did everything they could to get this big, heavy hatch open. It was like a cork. It had to be pulled into the spacecraft to get out, and they just didn't have time. And in about 20 seconds, the smoke and the flames basically killed the crew. They were overcome by toxic fumes. They were burned, but probably would have survived their burns, but they died of, they were asphyxiated. So this was a huge shock that these men were killed. And the great paradox of the American space program was that this happened on the ground. And the men designing the spacecraft were able to go through it and figure out what happened. And they fixed that spacecraft. And the Apollo command module and lunar module took 24 human beings to the moon, and 12 human beings walked on the surface of the moon. And my argument in my book is that none of this could have happened without the work and the sacrifices of Gus Grissom and his Apollo 1 crew.
We're going to go to a student question now for you.
Great.
And the first question actually deals about your writing rather than the actual story. How is writing a biography similar to and different from writing your articles for magazines?
Yeah, good question. The big difference is dealing with the 120,000 words and the difficulty of organizing your material into a narrative that makes for a compelling story. In journalism, you're almost stacking paragraphs. You're writing a lead and you're putting in what's called a nut paragraph, a summary paragraph, and then you look for a good quote, and then you sort of go from the general to the specific in your book. And the other way, or in your article, and in a book, you have to make a decision. Do you want it to be linear? This happened, then that happened. Well, I decided not to do it that way. It was sort of a nonlinear approach in that I sort of jumped around in time, and in this case, space, to tell Gus Grissom's story in the best way that I thought I could. I wanted to fill the historical gap about manned spaceflight, and Gus had been largely overshadowed by Neil Armstrong and John Glenn and Alan Shepard and these guys, who were all heroes, but so was Gus Grissom. And I wanted people to understand that part of it, and that took me 120,000 words and 7 years. So if you're going to do a subject like this, you got to be committed. You have to be passionate about it. And in daily journalism, you're sort of jumping from one subject to the next. But the great thing about a book is you can spend time with someone, get to know them. And the point of a biography is to tell the reader what this person was really like, to explain their life in toto.
And that actually leads me to the next student question, which is as follows. How do you determine what information from your research to keep in and what information to keep out of the finished biography? Because you have so much information, How do you know which part's relevant, which part may be interesting, may not be interesting? Because I'm sure that after 7 years of research, you can't put everything in there.
That's right. Well, as my favorite science writer, John McPhee, who I'd recommend to any of your students, says, writing is a process of selection. So you're going to go out and you're going to talk to as many people as you can, gather as much information as you can, synthesize that information, but you can't put it all in. So you have to pick and choose, and say you want to use some quotations. Well, pick the best one, the one that's most descriptive to make your point. You don't have to keep repeating that point. Find something solid that will make your point and drive the narrative of your book. So it's a process of selection and synthesizing information and listening to try to get at the truth, which, after all, that's the point. That's the point of the exercise, is to get at the truth.
And actually, my boys and I, they're 6 and 8 years old, were reading this book together and following along. Some of the words were a little bit too big for a 6-year-old, but they loved the story about his background and hard work ethic and space exploration, about the science part, about the oxygen not being regular air that we breathe mixed with some nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and how flammable it was. So it incorporates not only reading and writing and research, but also background of someone and science and technology. When you look at the back of the book, you have all of these endnotes. And the 8-year-old said, "What are those little numbers that we keep seeing at the end of the sentences?" And I said, "Those are endnotes. That means that the author did a lot of research." And that's going to bring me to the next student question. And the next student question that we have is, had there been any other biographies of Grissom that you used, and did you find out any new information in your research?
Yeah, there were at least two other biographies written about Gus. One by the pastor of his family's church in Mitchell, Indiana. So that was unique in that he had a special perspective, a unique perspective into Gus's family. He knew them, so he was able to sort of tell the story of Gus Grissom of Mitchell, Indiana. A second biography by, I think it was published by the Indiana Historical Society, focused heavily on Gus and in Indiana as sort of one of Indiana's heroes, which was great, but it had a title that I didn't think was accurate. It was called Gus Grissom, the Lost Astronaut. And part of my working thesis was that Gus Grissom was not a lost astronaut. He knew always where he was going and how he would get there. And that's, I think, why I wanted to change people's perception of this guy and the work that he did. The fact that he never wanted to call attention to himself. He was willing to do the nitty-gritty details. He loved machinery. He had to understand how it worked. And as one of the people who went to the moon, astronauts who went to the moon, Mike Collins said, if you wanted to find Gus Grissom, go look on the factory floor at midnight, and there you would find him with all the other astronauts trying to make this machine work.
The book is called Calculated Risk, and part of that calculated risk was he knew that there were some flaws in the capsule, in the spaceship. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the risks that he took because he knew that there were flaws in the system?
Right. So this sort of goes back to the earlier question about writing. What's the thesis of your book? And my thesis was that Gus Grissom understood the risks of a very dangerous enterprise, and that's flying in space. Space is deadly, and flying itself can be deadly. Gus was a test pilot, and the idea behind being a test pilot is you try to minimize risk. You don't take chances. You try to anticipate anything that could go wrong so that you can bring your machine back. But he always understood, as he said, as a pilot, the longer you're on the flight line, the better the chances are that something's going to happen. It's just, statistics. He understood that. He knew that going in, and he told his wife, Betty, if anything ever happens to me, throw a party, because I was doing what I wanted to do.
And finally, what would you like people to know about Gus Grissom, either that was not portrayed correctly in the film, or something that was the general theme of your book, or just the last idea of what Gus Grissom was all about?
Well, I think it was best summed up by a fellow Hoosier in Indiana who reviewed my book, and he made what I thought was a really valid point about Gus Grissom and Gus's family, that these were ordinary people who, through extraordinary effort, did extraordinary things. I think that's what Gus Grissom represents. You know, a small town guy, and there he is shaking the hand of the President of the United States. And nothing was handed to Gus. He earned everything he got. And he never thought of himself as a hero, but he did, and the other astronauts considered themselves pioneers. They were going someplace where humans had never gone before. And this is what drove him. This is what made him tick. And that's why I wrote the book.
All right, George Leopold, thank you so much for joining us, the author of an amazing book, The Calculated Risk, The Life and Times of Gus Grissom. It's a great read. Historically, it's for all ages. It is just a fantastic book, and thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Howard Shalowitz, again, thanking you, George Leopold. And remember,
Great to be with you.
prepare for tomorrow, educate today.